I'm Dr. Barb Smith from American Reading Company, and you are in for a treat. I am so happy to see people from all around the country. One of my favorite things to do is to spend time with Dr. Irvin Scott, and also our new friends, Dr. Dominic Wyse and Dr. Charlotte Hacking, from all the way from the United Kingdom. Today's webinar, Science of Reading 2.0, is labeled that way because Dom and Charlotte have added new knowledge to our thinking about the science of reading and to the field of literacy, and I should say reading and writing. And also, it's a good opportunity for us, as we've been really immersed in the science of reading conversation for a while, to really broaden our thinking and conversation as we work together this afternoon.
As we jump into a conversation with Charlotte and Dominic about this really important topic, and that is the science of reading. We're calling it Science of Reading 2.0. Both of them have recently authored a book, really powerful book. I have it right here. We'll give you an opportunity to track it down through a QR code. But it's an amazing book. I've been reading it, going through it, and it resonates deeply. Let me just start off by saying I am a former teacher, former principal, former district leader, and spent time at the Gates Foundation. And so I've been at the intersection of this educational work from a practice perspective. I'm currently at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, so from a research perspective, and also from a policy perspective. And I think this conversation does a nice job of the intersection of all three of those things, especially as it relates to reading. And I'm gonna jump right in. Well, let me just have Charlotte and say something, just a real quick snapshot of your background, your work, before we jump into our first question. Let me start with Charlotte, if you don't mind kicking us off, and then we'll go to Dom.
Yeah, my name is Charlotte Hacking, and I'm currently the Learning and Programme Director at the Centre for Literacy in Primary Education. We're a literacy charity that's based in London, England, but we work nationally and internationally with anyone involved in literacy education from early years through to children of age 11. Before that, I was a teacher, an educator, a leader in school, and very much invested in early years, particularly from children 5 to 7, looking at how early reading and writing develop.
Wonderful, thank you. And Dom?
Hi, thanks so much for inviting us. We're incredibly excited to be speaking today. Yeah, I'm Professor Dominic Wyse. I work at the Institute of Education, University College London, IOE UCL for short. I'm a researcher, but my background a long time ago, I also was a primary school teacher. I worked in inner city schools in London first, then Bradford in England, and then Huddersfield in England. I've been researching curriculum and more specifically the teaching of reading and writing for more than 20 years now. It's been such a huge pleasure to work with Charlotte properly for the first time on a book together, and so we can't wait to get stuck into the issues that we're raising.
Wonderful, thank you both. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to go back to our participants. I want to make sure you stay engaged. This is not just a conversation for you to hear us talk all that, although most of that will be hearing from our experts. But participants, do me a favor. If someone were to ask you to give them 1 or 2 words that come to your mind when you think of the science of reading for your own context, if someone said, give me 1 or 2 words, 1 or 2, not 3, not a sentence, words that come to mind when you think of the science of reading for your own context, I'm gonna give you 15 seconds to come up with those words and put them in the chat. And we're gonna look at those words, okay? 1 to 2 words come to your mind when you think of the science of reading. Okay, I'm seeing critical, research-based, systemic and explicit, unbalanced, evidence-based. Our panelists are also looking at them. Interlace skills, foundational, knowledge and decoding. Okay, wonderful. Academic ego. Interesting, interesting. Okay, it's going to be a powerful conversation. They're still coming in. Well, let's just jump right into the conversation. Even as you share those words, we really appreciate you sharing. So the book is The Balancing Act. I just love the word balance when thinking about the title. But one of the things that Dom and Charlotte do early on is they give a snapshot of what's happening, not just in the US, but internationally around reading, writing, phonics, the science of reading. And I just want to start off by asking them, why is it important for the US, primarily those of us who on this call, US educators to understand the reality of the fact that these conversations around the science of reading go beyond the US, and other countries and education systems are grappling with the same thing? Dom, why don't I start off with you, and then we'll go to Charlotte.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, the book is primarily about research, about practice. Yes, it's about our new model, the double helix. But we start the book with the recognition that the teaching of reading, for good or for bad, has become a political issue, has been for more than 100 years. It kind of waxes and wanes in the intensity of the debates. But perhaps one of the things that we do in the first chapter that's a bit new is to say, actually, these particular countries, particular regions are connected because politicians are traveling, something that we call in research, we call policy borrowing. And even that's relatively well understood in a general level, but not the kind of tracking which we've done is to show, for example, there was an MP in England who was invited to Australia pretty soon after Australia adopted some of the same practices that had been going on in England for a decade or more. And indeed, we're aware of people from the US in touch with people in the UK and so on. So we have this kind of sort of ecosystem, but maybe not 100% healthy ecosystem. So we thought it was important to track some of these movements. I think it's vital that it's vital for researchers that we have to look worldwide at what's happening, because if one makes a contribution to knowledge, it shouldn't be just knowledge in one region. It should be one that other, colleagues in other countries recognize. And so I'll hand over to Charlotte because those are my initial thoughts on that very issue.
Yeah, I think from an educator's perspective as well, it's really important for educators to connect more globally as well, looking at some of the successes that we're all seeing in the movements in children's language, reading and writing, but also the challenges that we're all facing, and that some of those things are universal challenges that we can overcome with the shared knowledge and the shared practices of what we're doing together to really look at what evidence is telling us, but also what's working on the ground with our children in front of us and how we can learn from them to kind of take on board the evidence, but also ensure that we're looking at the right evidence to make sure that evidence is actually making impact with every single child in our care.
Thank you both. Yes, just one thing I want to elevate is this notion that we can learn across the ponds, if you will, or learn across the differences that we have from a cultural or whatever perspective. And it's something that you try to lift up, not only the fact that there are similar challenges in different places, but there are also similar opportunities if we can stick to the research and learn from the research. I think Charlotte used this word of universal, which is really important. So thank you for that. That was one of the things that really intrigued me about the book, the way you started. Well, let's just jump into some of these research questions. So I'm a practitioner. That's where I've spent most of my career, just doing the work. And one of the things that I think sometimes we don't do enough of as practitioners is, because of time, is look at the evidence, look at the research to see how we can learn from what the latest research suggests as we talk about practice. So Don, why don't you kick us off by just you spend a lot of time researching these issues. Just talk to us a little bit about some of the historical context, if you will, around some of the models around the science of reading. It's a hot topic in the US. The media is driving it. Journalists are driving it. Can you speak from a researcher perspective around some of this?
Yeah, sure. So in relation to what we might call models or theories or metaphors or images, there are quite important stories to tell. So perhaps one influential model is called the simple view of reading. And we acknowledge these models because they're part of a tradition that we are responding to and hoping to add to. So a simple view of reading, proposed in the 1980s, useful model of children's development in reading, particularly focused on children with reading difficulties. And as the authors made clear, not a model for teaching. It's a model of learning, and learning is important. But I think one of the things that we feel is new about what we've tried to do is to say, if you want the best evidence-informed teaching, teachers will always look at models actually, and so will researchers, and there's nothing wrong with that. But then we do need to be looking for models that are about teaching that include all the key elements. So as you know, to be an effective teacher is a challenging job that requires the orchestration of many different aspects, all of which are important. So if there's one thing I would say about some previous models that, as I say, have offered us important things, they've not really been focused on teaching in quite the way that we think is needed. And indeed, we've found, as we were working on our book and our other, publications, the reading rope was another popular model, which interestingly was being picked up by teachers. And so that always interests us. What are teachers looking at and why? And then what's the relevance of the model to teaching? So it was really interesting to see that. Of course, the other thing about these models is they're what we would call seminal. So they've been around, for a long time. They've not necessarily been popular for a long time. So in fact, I remember Marilyn Jager Adams did a really good chapter where she was interested in what's called I think it's called something like the 3 triangles model. It was David Pearson's model, and she was trying to track down where it kind of originated. So there's definitely interest from both researchers and teachers in what kinds of models might usefully summarize what teachers might be doing to teach in a way that's more effective.
Very helpful. So one really important point that I want to just elevate is this notion of there are models of learning, there are models of teaching, and they're not necessarily the same. Mm-hmm. And trying to have that understanding is really, really important. And you gave some examples, and the book does a nice job of capturing some of these sort of historical examples and in sort of a summary way, which is really, really helpful. Charlotte, I wonder if you could say a word about, because we've got my sense is we've got teachers on, we've got principals on, we've got curriculum directors on, and some of them may be asking a question that I often ask when I was in similar years. How much of the research should I spend time on as I do my work day to day supporting teachers or supporting kids or supporting principals? What would you say to that question, Charlotte?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult thing for teachers at the moment because the work of teaching is increasingly high-paced and busy, and that time to filter through, there's so much research out there to filter through and see what is the research that I should be looking for, what is the research that is proven to be effective, we're going to be relying a lot on what's fed to us in the classroom to think about who are the people that are doing that for us, and are they looking at a broad enough range of research, not to just pick up what the next hot topic is, because, you know, almost there's so much research out there now that you can find something to prove any kind of theory that's out there. So where are we looking at the really broad spanning bits of research that show multiple examples of what works and what doesn't work, and how do we consolidate that in a way that teachers can see how it's really relevant to their daily lives? And I think that's what we've tried to do in the book. We've done the first half of the book really based on that kind of looking at the research and what's out there, but the second half putting it into practice for teachers in what we call the art of teaching. And we've used the art of teaching very purposefully, because teaching is that art of putting everything together and creating that optimal experience for your children based on what we've seen out there. And we've got lots of very good examples drawn from practice in the classroom, where you can see examples of teachers interacting with children, of the kinds of text that you use, and children's own writing and snapshots of their reading, so that you can actually see how it plays into practice.
Can I just add on to that? I think, Charlotte, one of the things that you were very keen for us to have is a set of principles. So the book is not a blueprint, because we think teachers are professionals who should be encouraged to make decisions on appropriate evidence. Now, if they've got certain principles in mind, one might be that if you isolate and narrow phonics teaching too much, it's not as effective as if you carefully balance it within many other elements. So principles such as that, the effective teachers can, having understood the detail, can run with those and apply them to many different kinds of lessons, many different kinds of contexts.
Wonderful. Yeah, no, I think to both your points, the book does a nice job. And this is why I would encourage practitioners, teachers, principal, district leaders of curriculum instruction to really consider the book, because I think research is really important. But to both your points, practitioners don't always have the time to look at that research. But what the book does, and someone asked me about the title is The Balancing Act, an evidence-based approach to teaching phonics, reading, and writing. I want to emphasize writing. Sometimes we don't talk enough about writing, but the book does a nice job of giving actual examples of what it looks like. What I called it when I was a principal, it was student work, right? And so the book does a nice job of showing some of that student work. But at the same time, giving sort of a foundational research perspective to what they are encouraging in practice. Let me continue on. I have to get to this question around the media, and either one of you can take it on, or both of you can take it on. And that is that a lot of what has happened around the teaching of phonics or the science of reading in the US context, and you show it in your example in the US, got to where it was because of, I'll just call her out, Emily Hansford's podcast, which just blew up in the US. And some might argue, present company included, one good thing is it put on sort of the national conversation in the US, the importance of reading. Charlotte, I'll start with you this time and then go to Dom. Talk a little bit about the role of the media around these conversations with respect to reading, and what should an educator be thinking about as they think about how they learn about these topics through the media. And then we'll go to Dom.
Yeah, it's really interesting because the media will have a spin and a story behind it. And again, it's making sure that we are able, one of the things that we really push through the Balancing Act book is giving children a broad spectrum of what reading is, so that we can develop children into critically engaged readers. And I think one of the things when navigating the stories that come out in the media is, are we critically engaging with them? So are we going behind the headlines, which can often be, we talk about language and grammar a lot in the book as well, grammatically constructed to really kind of build us into kind of crisis mode and crisis prevention mode? Are we looking beyond those headlines to say, okay, what is the research behind this? Have we got a crisis? What is the underpinning nature of it? And are we responding and reacting to it in the right way? Because it's really easy to make a snap decision and forge into something very quickly in kind of response to a crisis that's been activated. But actually, this is where we need to really think about, what is the history telling us? What is the evidence telling us? What is the actual issue that we're dealing with now? Because is it an issue with reading? Is it an issue with increasing child poverty and the foundations of reading needing work? Is it that actually we're not covering a broad enough element of literacy? Maybe we haven't been teaching phonics as well as we should have been, and that does need to be incorporated. You know, we called the book The Balancing Act because that's what we're really looking for, balance in a time of what could be perceived as crisis, to just go, hang on a minute, let's think and let's look at what's really happening here and what are the best steps in moving forward. Because, you know, the media can travel very quickly and it can be very reactive and make us engage in very reactive ways. Dom, I don't know if you want to build on that. You've done quite a lot of work on analysing some of the media.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I think without a doubt, the Soldier Story podcasts are an extraordinary phenomenon. One bit of me kind of very much admires the journalism in some respects. I mean, because if one impact of good journalism is impact, you know, widely in society, then there's no question. I mean, I don't know if this was true, that the Soldier Story podcasts were the second most downloaded podcast of all Apple's podcasts at one point in time. Now, to get the teaching of reading, which some might consider to be not a terribly exciting subject, of course we do, you know, in that kind of profile is really interesting. I can, as much as I understand it, I can detect some really good production. There's clearly significant money behind that, because you can't create things of that quality without that. Now, of course, yeah, we have some critical observations, funnily enough, and ironically maybe, around the research. And our view is that while some good research and some good researchers are, you know, singled out for praise, it's not a balanced appraisal in our view of the evidence base. And so that can lead us actually into some of the same problems we've experienced in, you know, historically, and indeed in the US. I think one of the things we mentioned in relation to our analysis of the Soldier Story transcripts is the fact that when George Bush was president, a big initiative and a lot of money was spent. And actually, it's dismissed a little bit in the podcast as kind of politically, it was undermined, it's argued. Well, in fact, there's a very good and very comprehensive report. I think it was a federal level report and a substantial look at what were teachers doing, what happened. Well, actually, they really did adopt what some people call science-based approaches to teaching. Unfortunately, the evaluation also showed that children's reading comprehension did not improve. Now, that for me is a serious worry whenever we are talking about claims and counterclaims, because to be perfectly honest, if reading teaching does not in the end result in the majority of children improving their reading comprehension, then we're doing something wrong. So yeah, I mean, it's an extraordinary phenomenon. I worry because it's a campaigning version of journalism. It's actually not even, some would say, not even balanced journalism. So we also cite other journalists who we feel have taken a more balanced approach. Colin Barras did a rather good piece in the New Scientists, unfortunately behind a paywall, as many of these things are. And other journalists, for example, in the Times Educational Supplement, in the Guardian newspaper. And in fact, I should mention the International Literacy Association in the US, who have, I found somewhere, a rather good guide to how to detect bias in media reports about literacy. So it's a lively area. It's shone a light, but I am concerned that, as I say, I'm not sure that really is a robust enough portrayal of the research that informs the teaching of reading and writing.
Very helpful. A lot shared from both of you. I think one takeaway is there could be some good in elevating these topics for educators, for kids. But we should still be cautious about where they lead us in terms of practice on the ground. And you gave several examples historically. I think it was Reading First. Reading First initiative under the Bush administration and whatnot. And maybe one of the takeaways for educators, teachers, principals is to ask the question, where are we? What's the evidence that's driving what we're getting ready to do? I think particularly for system levels, chief academic officers, those in charge of literacy. Barb, did you want to ask a question?
I think that's a perfect capstone to this part of our conversation, Dr. Scott. I was just thinking you and I were in school districts or technical assistants when Reading First was around. And just like the current iteration of what's happening with the science of reading, it put a spotlight on the problems we have in this country with getting all students to get to a level of literacy that is going to help them thrive in their lives. I think of it, though, as the law of unintended consequences. It's the translation from research to policy and legislation, from policy to practice, where we go awry. And I think we're at a critical moment in the science of reading conversations and what's happening in school districts, where we want to take a beat, look at and integrate all of the evidence we have. One of the best things about Reading First was it put a spotlight on literacy and gave additional training and funds to schools. But in some cases, what happened is we saw students who no longer received core instruction for intervention, so they didn't get an additional instruction, and schools stopped teaching science and social studies in some cases. So we're at a moment now where I think it's great to really look at what we're doing and think about what the unintended consequences are of some of these things.
Excellent point. Wonderful summary also, both bridging what we've done in the past to having us be cautious about where we're going in the future at this moment. Which takes us to another part of the book, which I really think is, I suspect that Dom and you and Charlotte are trying to sort of raise a yellow flag to say, wait, slow down, let's be a little more thoughtful here. And one of the ways you do that is through this double helix reading and writing framework, which I would love to do two things. One, I'd love us to share that visually so everyone can see it now, and then have you talk through it. Of course, you can get the book and look at it more deeply. But I just think it's a powerful way to capture this notion of let's be cautious and let's be thinking about many different things at the same time. Dom, you want to kick us off, or who's Charlotte's going to do that?
I'm happy to. I'm hoping that the image is showing now.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, great. So this obviously didn't exist until we started working together. So it's a genuinely new thing for us. We're really pleased that it seems to have captured the imagination of, for example, the 11 academics and practitioners who read a kind of proof version of the manuscript. A number of them have singled this out. So we think we're onto something. And as I think the first thing I'd want to say is, as I was saying earlier, it's a model of teaching. Now, of course, you can't completely separate learning from teaching. So it draws on those models of learning that have been influential, but we are presenting something that we feel is more appropriate to sum up what we think will be most effective in classrooms. I won't go through all the details because we have a chapter in the book devoted to where it came from and what it means. And in fact, well, the whole book is, of course, structured around this theory, this model, this metaphor. I'll start, and then perhaps Charlotte, you can get involved. I'll start at the top of it. Not that it's a particular linear type of thing. I think you could turn it around. You'd have to read the words sideways or upside down and so on. But I want to start with the right at the top, the child and their languages. And in there is so much, well, some people would say, well, it's obvious. If you're teaching, your first thought should be, what is the nature of the child that I'm teaching? What's their background? What experiences have they had, for example, with reading and writing at home? What's the level of their interest or lack of interest? Hence, that connects up with the middle of the model where we have motivation and meaning. Those drive everything. We think teaching and indeed policies on teaching should be driven by an explicit statement saying the teaching of reading and writing, it begins and ends with motivation and meaning. So, now other models, the child is almost absent, like ghosts, they're these kind of technical, not particularly models I've spoken about today, but some views of how children might be helped. The child seems absent. And for me, that's just, it's not tenable. And we know from the research, I should say, by the way, this isn't only in the book. We also had a peer-reviewed research paper published, which is only really about this double helix model. And it goes into some more research that we didn't have space to address in the chapter in the book. And it's freely available through open access, the paper. So, Charlotte, perhaps bring you in. I'm thinking particularly, around the environment, including text, for example, but,
Yeah, I mean, the difference is, particularly in the UK, and you can think about how similar this is in the US, reading and writing and speaking and listening have become very separate. And reading is taught over here. And even worse, phonics is taught over here, but reading for pleasure is taught over here. And I know lots of people picked up on the fact that Dom talked about that fact that if reading teaching doesn't improve comprehension, we're doing something wrong. A lot of what we're seeing in the UK at the moment is that actually reading and writing engagement are at really low levels here. And I think if we're not engaging and we're not motivating children in reading and writing, we're doing the job wrong. And this really is about a model of literacy. It starts with the child, it builds on their experiences, it drives everything towards motivation and meaning. And the DNA model itself was chosen very specifically because we wanted to really illustrate this as a uniquely human process. These are all human processes that we learn how to do throughout our lives. And not only do our languages, because our children might be speaking more than one language at home, they may be speaking different dialects and different accents, all of that affects their phonological knowledge and understanding as well. But also they grow up in very different environments. And will come to us with very different experiences of talk, of reading, of writing, of play in their homes. Now, that's one of the things I think we really need to look at, because if we're going to really meaningfully close the disadvantage gap educationally, we've got to address that kind of poverty and the increased child poverty that we're seeing in lots of our communities that really does impact on those foundational experiences that children bring with them. As a practicing practitioner, and I'm sure all the teachers in the room will know, your good writers are often those kids who read a lot. Your good readers are often your good writers. And they're all the children that have been talked to, have been played with, have been read to, have been made a list to go to the grocery store together so that they see models of writing in action. Those are the foundational experiences that drive them towards that motivation and meaning. So that when you start working on phonological awareness and phonemes, on letters, on how words are constructed, kids are engaged in that because they want to lift text from the page, or as writers, they want to communicate in writing for themselves as well. And those texts are really important as part of that. Again, thinking about how we learn, how different text works, what language works for a set of instructions versus telling a story, how I communicate with my different audiences for the purposes and forms that I want to create meaning in. And so that's why in the model, reading and writing are so closely interconnected, because our reading inspires us as writers, but also in writing, we often make sense of the phonics of writing more, that then impacts back on our knowledge of words for reading as well.
Wonderful. So much shared. Oh boy, I have so many questions. Where do I start? But anyway, this is just wonderful. So one of the things that Dom said early on, and you built on it, was this notion of starting with the child. Starting with the child. You said something to that effect, Dom, that I thought was so powerful. It made me think of a researcher that we have in the US. Her name is Zaretta Hammond, and she talks about culturally responsive teaching, which is about understanding the context in which our children come from and then building from there. So that was one big takeaway that I got from what you were sharing. I'm sorry, you put the model down. If you could throw it up there one more time.
Yes, sorry.
No worries, because one of the things that I think is really powerful, and I'm gonna read, I'm gonna take up this time. But one of the things that you say in the book, I'm reading the book, everyone. It says, unlike other models that are based on inanimate objects or abstract diagrams, our model is based on a living phenomenon in the essence of life, the double helix shape that is part of human DNA. And so in some ways, this symbolically says that the way to think about all of these sort of elements together is critical to being successful in this sort of literacy dynamic that we talk about. And the more we pull them apart, you could never survive or have identity if you pull DNA apart and try to do strands on their own. They have to come together in order for you to get identity, in order for you to have life in an organism. I wonder if you could just say maybe just one more minute about why it's so important to think about these things in an integrated way, which I think you did, but I just wanted to read that passage. We can start with you, Dom, and then go to Charlotte.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Because of course, the really important bits are what we've been talking about. But for us, the aesthetics of the actual visual model are also important, because not least because if you have something that is based on research evidence, that's based on analysis of robust theories and is rooted in practice, it's not much good if it's a kind of unattractive, inappropriate metaphor. And so although we're at pains not to say that the aesthetics are the be-all and end-all of everything, another thing we bring to the task is we're both rooted in the arts and creativity. Now, having, yes, I have led and been part of teams who do randomized controlled trials that are full of statistics, but I also have a sensibility around the arts and creativity. And so I want not only the model to be robust in the terms that we've discussed so far, but I want it to be robust aesthetically. And I'm sorry if I'm going to digress momentarily. When I was, so I did my first master's degree when I was a full-time teacher. And one day I went into the university library, and this is the days, I think, well before the internet. I was doing that old-fashioned thing. I was wandering across the bookshelves and just having a look at the books about theory, about research methods, actually. And I spotted this book, and I thought, oh, I'm interested in that. And it was by somebody called Edward Tufte. And it's, for me, to this day, still an extraordinary book. It's all about how visual models communicate complicated things effectively or not. One of the things that stuck in my mind was not only he wrote a whole book about, how do visual models, not just in education, there was a lot of it about science. I think, and in fact, I've rebought it recently because I didn't have a copy, so I managed to get a secondhand copy. Down to things not like, for example, in terms of health, I remember a troubling but effective image that showed clusters of stomach cancer in one part of North America, which didn't exist in other parts. And so that prompted speculation about, was it diet, etc. So it's full of, incidentally, he's the guy who, this is quite controversial. He did a publication that blamed to some degree the structure of PowerPoint as one of the contributors to one of the space shuttle disasters. And I wrote about that in another book I wrote about writing, and I thought it was astonishing, really interesting. And to cut a long story short, it was about the way that PowerPoint reduces everything to simple messages. He says in front of a PowerPoint slide.
I have to say, I was watching Irvin, Dr. Scott's face, and my own, and we were both like grinning at each other at the same time. I want to talk to researchers who are extremely credible and I can geek out, but I also want to go to dinner with. So thank you for being those people. Very, very much. And as a former classroom teacher, Title I coordinator, letters trainer, what I love about this, I do believe the aesthetics matter because they imprint. If I am now in a school district where I've got my core curriculum, I've got 3 or 4 different interventions, I've got 2 or 3 assessments, I have all these things going on, they can become stacked like boxes upon boxes upon boxes. Pretty good. Karen Vyse recently was talking about the phonics patch, where if the direct instruction in the core curriculum didn't fix it, then we're going to add on, but we're going to keep adding on. What I love about the double helix is it shows the living symbiotic relationship between reading and writing in real teaching. Mm-hmm. Most of the knowledge building curriculums, and I'm not going to talk about ARC all day, folks. Because I really think about the knowledge building curriculums as almost like a sisterhood out there. I don't care whether it's anything on the Knowledge Matters website. All of these curriculums share the idea, and I'm saying this for teachers to help bring this to life. If I've got a culminating task where kids are writing about some big, worthy, meaningful thing that they care about, whether I'm arguing about which animal is going to survive and adapt, or looking at literary analysis, I care about it. With a backwards design, I've got my culminating task I'm driving towards and a sequence of worthy, interesting texts that I'm using. And I think for me, I look at this and I can see a unit plan.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, what sometimes nobody should leave this webinar going, oh my goodness, American Reading Company says this is the only way to do things, or there's only one model for reading. No, we've got to be integrators. This is the moment, people, in the science of reading. I don't know about some of you, but science of reading 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0, I want to get it right this time. And we're at a tipping point here, folks. So when I look at comments in the chat and conversations I'm having, this is a time to integrate all of our thinking. And all of the models we talked about in reading certainly inform our work. But your writing models are far less familiar to most. And it's the putting it all together. Teachers are struggling and principals are struggling to help them to put it all together in a way that actually creates a meaningful student experience where they learn to read and they want to come to school.
Yeah. So no, that's beautiful. Barbara. Love that, or love that appeal. Um, and it actually makes me think, Charlotte, I don't know if you wanted to add to anything that Dom said, but I
No,
did
well,
want to give this one question.
I was just gonna add to it that it's about putting all of these elements together, because I think it's that what you were saying about struggling to cover it all and put it all together. We kind of lose the purpose of why we're doing what we're doing, and we learn phonics to read and to write. It's part of it. There was a long time when, we needed more subject knowledge and more subject development in phonics, and how to teach it well, and how to teach it systematically, and how to introduce those basic sounds so that kids could blend and they could segment. But that's in order to read and to write. So, we had something called the Rose Review in England, which led to, a renewed focus on phonics. And one of the things that was unhelpful that came out of that was this notion of a discrete phonics session. You do need to teach phonics skills. Kids are not going to learn them on their own. You do need to absolutely do it, but not discreetly, because phonics is part of reading and of writing. And it got taken down a very reading focused way. And we have to think about, actually, for those youngest children who really want to put pen to paper to actually describe their thoughts, their feelings, their ideas, their interests. As Barb was saying, I want to tell you something about my pet dog and what he did yesterday. Putting that phonics into practice in writing is really important for kids, and being able to read back their own writing meaningfully because they've mastered that art of phonics really does impact on their reading skills as well, and how they take phonics on board for reading. So I think it's about, it's not separating things out. It's about looking at how do we enable our children to be fully literate with all of the benefits that brings.
Yeah. Go ahead, Dom.
Sorry, quickly to jump on that as well. I mean, it reminds me that we've been we've been doing various presentations. It would have been around the world, but it's all webinars, which is still around the world. But we've kind of worked out as an approximation, we think children in England, 5-year-olds in England and 6-year-olds in England, are exposed to 15% of their whole curriculum time. This is every day in school for their lives from 5 to 7. 15% of their curriculum is synthetic phonics. And by the way, in England, it is intended that all children will get that 2 years of phonics, irrespective of how well they read. Now, at the very least, some parents, some politicians, some educators, some researchers should be saying that's inappropriate. Coming back to the Sold a Story podcast, some of the neuroscientists quoted on there say 40% of children don't need systematic phonics of any kind because they learn to read naturally. Now, if that's true, and it's very difficult to prove these things, and it depends on the particular school and the class, and that could be that 40% of children are having 15% of their time wasted. They're not learning optimally, and we should all be concerned about that. So I think one of the things I've discovered through engaging with the reading debates for a long time, and most recently studying them, their current form, which is this kind of like a germ, global education reform movement, is I rarely see people who are advocates for narrow synthetic phonics acknowledging there are some risks about overdoing it. And I think that's another crucial thing of our message. I mean, it's, as I say, the book is not really about politics, but it does address some of the politics necessarily. But there are real risks out there. They're not conceded.
I think it goes back to what you were saying before, Irvin, about the media as well. This whole notion of the reading wars is really unhelpful, I think, because it suggests two sides, and it suggests lurching from one side to another and a constant battle. I think where we're trying to get to with the balancing act is to kind of be we would say Switzerland over here, to be the Switzerland in between, going, actually, all kids need phonics. We're not disputing that at all, but they need to see the purpose of it within an approach that is going to get them literate, get them motivated to read, get them want to reading, get them wanting to write and compose things and to have voice, choice, and agency for themselves. That's what we want to see by the end of it. And it's some of those kind of really unhelpful clickbait media headlines that kind of drive this kind of idea that there's an opposition in here.
Yeah, one way that it sort of lands with me, specifically around phonics, is that phonics is a means to an end. It's not an end itself. And if we're not careful, the media will drive it as an end in itself. And particularly the Sold the Story was particularly, and I'm not critiquing Sold the Story, just to be really clear. I listened to the whole thing, thought it was phenomenal. I thought it was powerful. But its focus was primarily on marginalized communities, marginalized students. And so the risk there is that those students are the ones who could end up doing phonics like so intensely if we're not careful and not engage in rich literature,
and we're not addressing the real problem here, which is social mobility and the increase in child poverty and the wide chasm of that exists in more communities than others. You know, I am a firm advocate of early years phonics because all of the kids I've taught in very inner city communities over here in London have been lifted by phonics, but that has to come on that basis of being read to, being talked to, being played with, and having the means to the ends to do that itself. I mean, you've got great stuff in the States like Dolly Parton's Imagination Library that makes sure that kids get the books with their parents that don't have the means, that have had their local library shut down. We need to look at where does phonics fit? What are the foundations phonics build on? Because when we've got that motivation, that meaning for phonics to be investable, because it helps me get to where I want to go.
And I'm going to jump in, my friends, because we have gone all the way up to final words from Dr. Scott. I appreciate how lively this discussion has gotten. I think whether in your school district, the decisions you make lean more towards synthetic versus contextualized phonic. What we care is that what you do is systematic and meaningful and driving towards the end all goal of students who can and want to read. What we're trying to do here, again, is help everybody to take a moment, consider, think critically about what's happening in our classrooms so that we can move to higher levels of literacy rather than continue this spin cycle where we reform goes wrong, and then we were back in the same cycle every 15 years. So I'm sure we're all going to find things from today to agree with, to disagree with, to wonder. And that means, Dr. Scott, you and I have done our job. I'd like to turn it to you for a final word, Dr. Scott. I want to thank our ASL interpreter and thank Dominic and Charlotte for this time coming across the pond virtually. Dr. Scott?
Absolutely amazing. Thank you so much. I'm going to use my minute or so to just elevate a really important question. And I'm going to give Charlotte and Dominic the opportunity to give a closing word. To the extent that you can say something about this really important question, that's phenomenal, but you can give a more general thought also. And the important question was, well, they're all important questions, but I really want to elevate this one because it's particularly true for the US context. The person says, I am interested in knowing how this applies to teaching biliteracy with other languages like Spanish, for instance. I teach Spanish immersion students who are learning to read and write in Spanish. So you can't be in too many places in the US without having to deal with this biliteracy question. So as you close and you have, I trust everyone gets the book. Maybe you can say something about that and also a closing thought. Let's start off with you, Charlotte, and then Don. Really appreciate you today.
Yeah, I mean, I think what we're talking about here is being literate and how do we become literate in all of our languages. And that's why at the start of the double helix model, it starts with the child and their languages, because, you know, the child has to see themselves in their home language and their first language before they are learning the English that they are picking up alongside that as well. So to engage children in that language-rich approach where language is centered on meaning and meanings across languages is really important for all children. I think the other thing to look at is the kinds of ways that phonics particularly is different in different languages as well. Lots of languages, again, like Spanish, is much more transparent. So if you can see how words work in Spanish and then you look at how words work in English, you can have an investigative approach to how the sounds and shapes of words work and what's similar and what's different across languages as well. And that means that teachers have to have that broad knowledge of how language works, but also the text that are going to engage children as well. And I think one of the things that we missed saying today, what we've hopefully covered more in the book, is that all children should see that literacy and literature is a place and a space for them. And the books that we provide for our children should be reflective of all of the children in our communities. And I think one of the things, we've got a lot of work still to do. I know you've done some great work for many years on this over in the States, and we're looking at the model for that over here, is to make sure that all children see themselves reflected in the literature that we're giving them to read and write, so that they have that motivation and investment. But also, as Barb was saying before, that we have that voice and choice and agency in what and how we write. And are we giving children opportunities to write and read in home languages and in English, and learning how those languages work in tandem? Dom, do you want to build on that?
Yeah, two very quick things. One, going back a bit, a really nice study that looked at both monolingual English speakers and bilingual speakers, including Spanish. And even, as I recall, even in homes where the parents couldn't speak English, if they helped their child just simply by sharing books, for example, using Spanish language, it helped the English develop. And then coming bang up to date, I'm the only non-US member on the International Literacy Association Dyslexia Task Force. And right now we're wrestling with some guidance for teachers around what should you do if you want to try and assess children in your class who may have reading difficulties, but who are speaking more than English. And it is a very difficult area, actually, because really things like the diagnostic screeners are typically for the English language. But if a child is really dyslexic, they will show those characteristics in all the languages they speak, because it's a fundamental thing. We don't fully understand the neurological basis, but it's a very important kind of final topic to end. And as Charlotte says, the book has tried as much as possible to reflect our views that it's all children. And we quote a statistic. I'll finish with a statistic. 30% of children in what we call nursery classes, so that's 4-year-olds, 3 and 4-year-olds, 30% speak a language other than English at home. Now, that's evidence enough that we cannot have teaching models that are monocultural and monolingual.
Thank you both for a wonderful discussion. Barb, over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. Now I want to talk about integrated assessments and using assessments together for another hour. But Michael Galvin is going to give us our marching orders here. I'm looking for some slides that are going to let us know, one, where you can read this thought-provoking and aesthetically pleasing book. I will say it's loaded with practical examples and a global view. Next month, we have another treat for you. David and Meredith Levin have written a highly engaging book, in their No Better Do Better series about comprehension, which is also misunderstood. So again, I hope you see what American Reading Company is trying to do this year is to take the topics that are on the cusp of what we're talking about right now. Folks are like, where's the writing in the science of reading? How do I tend to that? How do I make that all work? Wait a minute, my kids are learning about dinosaurs, but I don't know if I'm helping them use that knowledge. How am I teaching comprehension? What's happening? So two great back-to-back books. Also this year, you'll be hearing from district leaders. You'll be seeing Dr. Scott quite a bit as our host for conversations. So I want to thank everybody. We hope to see you August 20th. Please feel free to engage with us in any way following this webinar. You'll be receiving follow-up resources. No, we couldn't quite answer every question. It was a pretty lively chat, but we will provide follow-up resources, and you also have the link to the book. Thank you all.